Okay, so I'll just begin then with a little entree to challenges of globalization, with the subtext ultimately being examples from the Gebusi. And starting with the idea that globalization as a worldwide hope of positive development. We talked about colonialism, some of the negative dimensions of colonialism. In recent decades, there's been a strong sense that the world is becoming more interconnected in various ways that we'll talk about, and that at least hopefully this is a positive development. Now, globalization, as we know, is not unmitigatedly positive, right? There are some negative aspects, but the hope and the desire as kind of almost a global cultural or kind of orientation is that it should or has the possibility of connecting us across cultures and peoples and areas in a positive way. So the idea is that if we're able to grow with the economy and make more money and have more commodities, that it should improve our lifestyle, should improve our standard of living, and that's a strong hope. And most countries of the world today, almost all really, with only very few exceptions, have development plans and schemes that will grow the economy and develop things that will have hopefully a positive impact on social development, politics, culture in general, right? So that's a very strong kind of sentiment. I found this in my travels across 20 different or so countries in the developing world. This is a fairly consistent kind of theme in those countries as well as in developed ones. So the idea is that more commodities and material wealth should be a good thing that should improve the lives, and if things globalized, of virtually everyone or the vast majority of people, that there should be more jobs and better wages as a result of these kinds of developments, that you have better infrastructure, better sense of communication, of roads, of transport, of being able to connect people and ideas together, and improved education. These were the functions we associate with the state, as talked about before, right? That improved education, health, care, and security, things that are in a modern sense associated with the contemporary nation state often, right? So that's kind of the positive side, or the potential, I think, that is very commonly shared in increasing parts of the world today. And I would argue and suggest, as Eller does also, that globalization as a behavioral fact, behavioral social reality, does have some significant changes. It does increase the movement of goods, people, and ideas across the world. This has been, it's probably non-real arguable, but just a couple of concrete examples from some of my own work. This is a photo of a woman, a Chinese woman in Lhasa in Tibet, which has been absorbed into China. And so here's the archetypal, what was often considered the Shangri-La, this roof of the world area, and the corridor around the main temple, which used to be an area of great prostration and devotion and so on. And some of Tibetans come from other parts of the country, or other parts of Tibet or China, and dress up in tradition. And so these people are side by side in the same space, and all these goods for sale, kind of like a Walmart in what used to be a very sacred corridor around the Jokhang Temple in Lhasa. So that's one concrete example of movement of people, goods, and ideas crossing borders in various significant ways. Another example is from India, a rural area, going across a gorge with this huge ravine, and all of a sudden these two big cement mixers and a whole bunch of people pouring cement by hand and making a bridge across this river. And most of these people are Nepalese, come in from another country, and here they are, piling into a pickup truck. And then this is the mode of kind of transport. So obviously, the idea of economic development, certainly in this country and many others, increases movement of people, goods, and ideas as well. Now, increased flow of mass media is another one that's pretty inarguable, the world being pretty much more interconnected. In terms of small media, but also mass media. Here's a billboard sign I picked up in India and this is one of the poorest parts of India, actually. And promoting a pink house. Could be like the home on the prairie. Who knows where these images came from and float through. But make your dream home a reality, with a little bit of Hindi, I believe, through UCO Bank. And other forms of media that transport across the world as well. Here's another example from Liberia in West Africa. in which the country, as I mentioned before, a quarter century of civil war, really was devastated. And coming back and trying to establish through NGOs, international NGOs, business opportunities in this one area has a not-to-be-sold business literacy quick impact project manual for people to get started on their feet with small local businesses of shops and beauty salons and things of that sort. And here's John Falla, an employee of the IRC, which actually has its headquarters, I believe, here in Atlanta, the International Rescue Committee, who has a list of things that entrepreneurs might want to do in their practice to get going for underdevelopment in Western Liberia here, based on this media of ideas that are flowing from a Western sense of business development. Kind of a little bit like a very rural developing country dimension of a proto-business school, if you will. Okay? Rapid and instant communication is a third one, which many people is pretty inarguable. Images across the world. In fact, the cover of our textbook by Eller, has a woman probably from the Mideast, somewhere maybe the Maghreb, sitting in a sand dune, perhaps in the Sahara, with her laptop computer. And in my own, just this summer, I was able to snap this photo of two monks from Myanmar, or Burma, in one of the main pagoda complexes in Yangon. And Myanmar was a very closed country until quite recently. In fact, cell phones are really just coming in. You can only buy them at it's a very elaborate procedure at the airport to get a cell phone. But parts of the world, and even Gebusi, they don't work very well, and the towers are pretty, But in principle, there's a little bit of text messaging even among a couple of Gebusi as well. So certainly rapid, if not instant communication, is a phenomenon which has increased around the world as well. And I would suggest that in terms of a cultural sensibility, a very strongly shared cultural, but with different local inflections, of course, development and progress in Liberia or in Myanmar or in Atlanta, and the different class segments of Atlanta is going to be very different. But there is a strong sense of desire for positive development that has hinged in some degree on a hope of greater interconnection and greater globalization. Here's a shot of a gas station in Myanmar. Until just a very few years ago, gas was very expensive and not easily available except through black market subterfuge in Myanmar, unless you were a government official. And now, here's a gas station attendant in a brand spanking new gas station on one of the routes in Burma, Myanmar. And obviously the sense of employment, desire, awareness are very common. Now, so this is to some degree in a reality. If you want to stress globalization as a reality, you might emphasize that's kind of the coin. But there's another side to this, which is this kind of complement or other side, which from an anthropological perspective is, I think, extremely important. And that is the challenges to development amid these great hopes and expectations, as it were. And one of them is that the spread of growth and development is extremely uneven. That on the whole, there may be greater communication, transportation, so on. How many people in the world really have passports? How many people really can travel? How many Gebusi are able to really get out? So the development of capitalist growth is extremely uneven. I mean, think of, say, China. Well, millions and millions of people in China are in rural areas or kind of have no formal citizenship status within urban areas. So it's extremely uneven, in fact, when you look at the human experience of development. And it's at once opportunistic, spotty, and can rise and fall very quickly. Because of the sense of desire for development, it's easier or common to think of development as being like a peanut butter spread that's really covering everything. But in fact, if you look at where the money comes, where the pipeline goes, or where the corporation has a headquarters, or who gets employed by that corporation, there can be a tremendous amount of money in a certain area for a certain segment of people, or a certain urban context, but other areas are left out. And also can rise and fall quite quickly. In our own American past, we think of, say, the gold rush, the 49ers. Gold was made by a few people over a short period of time, and then it went bust. So there's a boom and there's a bust. And that's one of the ways in a local and an experienced way that capitalism works, right? It's not always good for everybody, and a lot of people are left out. But the general sense is that it should be, the rising tide should be occurring and should be floating all the boats. Now, on a global scale, many countries stay relatively undeveloped and see themselves as undeveloped relative to more developed countries. And many areas lag behind within their country. So the kind of double edge of having desire and hope for globalization, some of which is a genuine phenomenon that's very widespread, and yet relative to those expectations, many people feel themselves left behind, and can feel left behind in a number of different ways, some of which not only in absolute terms, but if you see other people around you. You know, if you're an Indian, you see people, you know, driving Mercedes and having large apartments, and you know, media and the television and radio and billboards and so on create a sense that this should be a general shared phenomena, but relative to what I have, I may feel very disempowered or disenfranchised with respect to it. Okay? And also relative to media images and representation, so the spread of all these images and so on has a large impact, but it's not necessarily reflecting the behavioral reality of what people experience in their actual daily lives. Okay? And then finally, relative to greater development, perhaps even in their own past. And if you look, for instance, at the real income of Americans, it may have been flat. You know, we've had a bump in the stock market recently, but you know, relative to your parents' generation, at some point, American society may be experiencing a sense that it's actually a decline, or at least coming to terms with the fact that growth will not be that significant. And certainly, some areas are like that. And even among the Gebusi, if you remember in part 2 of the book, 1998, there was this great sense of forward development, and then it kind of dropped off the cliff, right? And so relative to your own past, sometimes these challenges occur as well. Okay, so what we'll do now is to shift to some of these video clips showing some of these aspects among the Gebusi, and then we'll come back to a few questions after that.
Okay, here we are at the Nomad Market on Tuesday. It's a twice-a-week market, and you can see a range of food here along the benches, but it's nowhere near as much as it was before. And this is really an interesting kind of reflection of the local cash and exchange economy. With the airstrip being largely closed with the ruts on the runway, planes haven't really been landing very often, and many of the government workers have left. There's just like 3 school teachers who are not from here, and no police, and no real government officers here. And they were the ones that were paid regular wages that help stimulate the local economy. So the market kind of is a reflection of the state of the general economy. And in comparison with other times I've here, this market is really doesn't have a whole lot. I mean, you can see there are, you've got bananas, and you've got some okari nuts, and other kinds of foods, greens, various kinds. But when I was here in 1998, you had like 4 or 5 times as much food and a much more active economy of exchange going on. Most of these piles are standard price, so usually like 20 toya, which is like a dime. So like one of those piles of okari nuts, delicious okari nuts, would be like a dime, or bunches of bananas would be a dime. And even at that, they really can't sell very much because people don't have much money. So the economy here really is dependent largely on the airstrip and outside things coming in and people with wages. And when that's down and the airstrip doesn't function much and the government people have left, the local economy really goes down. So people complain a lot about not really having clothes that aren't fully ripped up or other things that they feel that they really have come to depend on. And the market generally is kind of a reflection of that. You might remember actually in the Gebusi book on the chapter that has the market on it, reflection of the market, how difficult it was to exchange a 2-kina note, and a ripple effect of all the exchanges that went on as people tried to put together change for that. And that market was hugely bustling, whereas here it's much more desultory. It still is an area that people from different ethnic groups, or what we otherwise call tribes, come together, and it's also a place that women can have a strong role. So the sellers along the bench are almost all women, which is important. So they bring the food in. But as I've mentioned in the book, often the food is not sold. Many of the food items that they've really gone deep into the forest to get, collected carefully, brought all the way to the market, they won't have a chance to sell it. So in many cases, they'll just either give it away or take it back, and all that work will be really lost. So the investment in market is great because women and others want to get some coins, some money from exchange with local produce, but it's really tough because the cash that people have to spend on it is pretty low. So it is a center of social activity. It brings people together from different ethnic groups. It's a place that women can have a role in the local economy. It's a place there, a way station or a transition point between subsistence food and a cash economy, but it's pretty minimal by comparative standards, including in the past. So things are moving on in terms of globalization in the world generally, but some places are kind of left out, and this is one of them. Okay, thanks a lot. Here we are at the Nomad Subdistrict office, and this place is fairly remarkable for what's not here. When I've been here every time before, even in 2008, when the market and other economy was low, this place, especially on market day, which is today, on a Tuesday, this place would be bustling with people. There would be, the radio would be going, the officer would be there trying to communicate with the outside world, and you can see it's closed tight as a drum, and the closed door is kind of an interesting symbol of the whole thing. But there's no government officer here at all. The police quarters that were on the left here, the police office, is shut. There are no police, no constables, who were important for dispute settlement and also for other issues of law and order, so to speak. That is totally shut down. The government office on the right is also closed. There's no government officer here. And this office, since I was first here in the 1980s, was always the central hub of communication with the outside world, with development projects, with people interacting with the government, programs of various kinds, and now there's no one here. So it really is quite significant, both in real terms but also symbolically, of the fact that, as Gebusi said in 2008, the government here has kind of died. And as a result of that, people's connection and understanding and respect for the government has declined. They just see it as kind of a present absence. Many of the officers here still take their pay as government officers at Nomad, but because of the airstrip being closed, they say they can't really work here, so they live in Kyonga or another town and take their pay there. So the money budgeted for this office is still there by the government, but it simply isn't used actively on the ground here, and the officers who are paid, those who remain on the payroll, are not physically present. So it's kind of a sad indicator of the decline of government in outstation areas, and over time, the church and outside business development, corporations that are exploring for oil and so on, pick up the pieces of the infrastructure. And this is a common pattern in outstation areas in countries where the government either doesn't or can't get funds to local areas, that they depend increasingly on, so the church, the Catholic Church and others, and any money that they get from oil and gas or other compensation or business developments from outside multinational corporations, such as they are in some parts of the country, pick up the pieces that the government has left. So that's an important kind of development in that the idea that health and education, welfare and government facilities kind of support the people is very hard to maintain in outstation areas and has really declined since Papua New Guinea independence in 1975, progressively to the present time where this government office is completely closed. Okay, here we are in front of one of the abandoned government houses. When the Australian Colonial Office established the post here, these houses were probably originally built around the early 1970s. They set out a row of 2 sets of houses for the government officers. And when the post was still under Australian auspices, then the government officers would live in these. And there were a bunch of different officers and departments. And that got turned over to the Papua New Guinea government when the country became independent in 1975. Since then, there's been little maintenance of the houses. And you can see the results of their being abandoned and really some of them pretty unlivable. On the other hand, you may be able to faintly hear some music in the background. This has become places where people that are associated vaguely with the government, or maybe squatters of a certain kind, or teachers, somehow make these structures still livable, so they're able to continue using them. But it is again symbolic of the fact that the government officers, even under Papua New Guinea governance, there were a range of departments here. There are different officials. There was a development officer, school teacher officer, the police, the government officer in charge, the deputy officer in charge, the radio operator, and many of those people were given these houses to live in. So this is kind of ground zero of the government staff community, as it were. And these houses now, some of them are closed up, a few of them are used casually, and the grass has grown up, and you can see it's become something relative to what it was before, a derelict area. And if you remember from the very first beginning of the Gebusi, in the little section on entry, I believe it's called, there's a line about the plane coming down. You can see the twin row of houses glinting in the sun as the plane circles, getting ready to land on the spine of the book you have yet to read. Well, these are those houses, which are really no longer glinting in the sun, insofar as the roofs are now rusted out and the buildings are falling into disrepair. So here we are on the Nomad airstrip, and this is surprisingly significant. You see these ruts in the ground, and this is the reason why the planes can't land or land only very infrequently, and the most important air service, the MAF service, will no longer land at Nomad at all. This is one of the oldest airstrips in the whole, and one of the, in principle, best, longest, flattest airstrips in the whole district. However, the grass is growing up, and you can see a little further, the grass is really growing up, and the grass, the soil has become so sedimented over time, it really should be hard, like a gravel surface for the plane to land on. And this area gets 12 feet of rain a year, and the planes skid when they land. And as mentioned in the Gebusi book on the return portion, and for 2008, if the plane skids to the point where it pitches forward and the propeller touches the ground on these single-engine planes, it can flip the whole plane and everybody crashes. So it's quite dangerous. And the basic closure, or almost virtual closure, of the Nomad airstrip has an enormous influence on the entire area, because government workers can't get in and out, pay can't come in, all the supplies. Now we have to walk several hours further away than ever before up to Haudenosaunee in a different language group, even to get to Gebusi, because of the closure of this airstrip. And it's a tremendous amount of work to fix it, because it's a long airstrip and they've got to put gravel and grade it. And in principle, the government has money to do it. However, slippages, graft, inefficiencies, and other problems, the people are not willing to work for free to keep up such a big airstrip, because there's a tremendous amount of work, and the government in principle has money, but it's slippage between lip and cup. And so the airstrip is really falling into bad disrepair. And these ruts are kind of the end result, along with the grass. And one of the MAF planes that tried to get in, it got stuck. And it was very dangerous. And so they will not fly here anymore. There are a few services that will occasionally, but this airstrip was first built in 1963, and it was in continuous service up until the 2000s. And then since then, it's been open and closed, but now closed to regular traffic pretty much, except for some of the more adventurous charter companies which are willing to risk landing here, but that doesn't happen very often. So it's a real significant impact on the entire economy, kind of shows how certain outside developments have a really big impact on local area as a ripple down effect through the entire community. So the local economy and the kind of desultory market and difficulty of people to get clothes and other things which they want is really strongly impacted by this rut right here. And it's in the center area of the whole district, so you see the rest of the nomad government station around and the rainforest in the distance.